The blizzard didn't care that he was 15. It didn't care that his boots were held together with duct tape, or that the last thing he'd eaten was half a granola bar he'd found in a gas station trash can. It didn't care that the bruise above his left eye was still bleeding, or that the man who put it there was probably already asleep in a warm house somewhere, unbothered, unafraid, living the life of someone who had never been required to answer for anything. The mountain didn't negotiate. The cold didn't pause. Wyoming in February was not a place that made exceptions for boys nobody wanted. Tommy Voss walked anyway. He walked because stopping meant dying, and dying meant the man with the warm house would win. That was the only mathematics that mattered now. 1 foot forward, then the other. The snow swallowed each step whole, erasing the proof that he had ever existed, and the wind came down off the ridge like something with a purpose. Not malicious, just indifferent, which was somehow worse. He had been walking for 4 hours. He had stopped counting miles. Before you follow Tommy into the dark, if this kind of story reaches into your chest and squeezes something real, subscribe to this channel and hit the notification bell so you never miss what comes next. Drop a like if you're already feeling it, and leave a comment telling me the city and country you're watching from. I want to see how far this story travels. Now, let's go back into the storm. The last time Tommy Voss had slept in a real bed was 11 days ago. The Hendersons' house, if you could call it that, if the word house still meant something that included safety, sat at the edge of Rollins on a lot where the grass had given up trying years before Tommy arrived. He had been placed there 7 weeks earlier by a caseworker named Brenda, who smelled like cigarettes and wore the same expression every time she looked at him, a specific kind of tired that had calcified into something resembling professionalism. She'd handed him a paper bag with 2 changes of clothes, told him the Hendersons were good people, and driven away before he finished blinking. They were not good people. He'd learned that on the 3rd night when Dale Henderson came home smelling like cheap bourbon and found Tommy eating the last of the bread. Dale had a particular philosophy about resources, about boys who didn't earn their keep, about teaching lessons the right way. Tommy had taken the lesson across his face and his ribs and learned it thoroughly. He'd reported it to Brenda on the phone 4 days later. She told him all placements had adjustment periods, that conflict was normal, that he needed to practice patience and gratitude. He'd hung up and started planning. 11 days of small preparations, watching the weather reports on the Hendersons' television when they weren't home, studying the roads on a gas station map he'd pocketed on a supply run, collecting what he could, a half-used roll of duct tape, 1 foil emergency blanket he'd found in the garage, 3 granola bars from a camping kit nobody had touched in years. He'd reinforced his boots the night before he left, wrapping the sole of the left one where it had begun to separate, sitting on the bathroom floor at 2 in the morning with the tape in his hands and the specific calm of someone who has already decided. He left on a Tuesday. He walked out the back door at 5 a.m. while Dale snored and the house smelled like stale beer and old carpet, and he did not look back. Not because he was brave, because there was nothing behind him worth the turn. He had a plan. The plan was Casper. He had a name, Marcus Webb, a cousin of his mother's, a man he'd never met but whose name appeared on a birthday card Tommy had received at age 9, the only birthday card he'd ever gotten from a relative who was still alive. The card said, "If you ever need anything, find me." Tommy had kept it in his shoe for 6 years. It was held together now with the same tape as his boot. Casper was 240 miles north. He had made it maybe 60 when the storm changed. The weather forecast had said light snow through the afternoon, clearing by evening. The weather forecast had been wrong in the way that only Wyoming weather could be wrong, completely, catastrophically, without apology. The light snow became a whiteout within 40 minutes, the visibility dropping to less than 10 feet, the wind shifting from a nuisance into something structural and violent. Tommy had been walking the shoulder of Route 287 when the world simply disappeared around him. He left the road because the road disappeared. He climbed higher because the tree line offered some protection from the lateral wind. He moved in what he believed was a northward direction, but stopped trusting direction sometime around the 2nd hour, when the compass on his cheap digital watch fogged over and refused to function. He was operating on instinct and stubbornness and the single repeating thought, keep moving or die. That was when he heard it. Not a voice. not a cry. Just a sound beneath the wind, something structural, metallic, a groan that didn't belong to a mountain. His body stopped before his brain had processed the reason. He stood in the snow with his head tilted, the cold eating through his jacket, and he waited. There. Again. He moved toward it. The SUV was nearly invisible. It had left the road somewhere above him, judging by the trajectory of the crushed guardrail he found first, bent and twisted, half buried in the snowbank, and had rolled or slid down the embankment before coming to rest against a pair of mature pine trees that had absorbed the final impact and stopped it from going further down the slope. The vehicle sat nose down at an angle, the windshield a spiderweb of fractured safety glass, the front end compressed, the engine dead. Snow was already beginning to drift against the passenger side. Tommy approached it the way he approached everything dangerous, carefully, watching his own footing, saying nothing. He got low and looked through the side window. In the back seat, two small boys were belted into car seats, both of them awake, both of them staring at him with the enormous round eyes of children who have not yet learned which fears are rational and which ones can kill you. They were maybe 4 or 5 years old. Identical. Same dark hair, same pale faces, same expression of absolute incomprehension at what had happened to their world. One of them had a thin line of blood at his temple. Neither was screaming, which told Tommy they were either deeply in shock or had exhausted themselves screaming before he arrived. The driver, a man, adult, heavy-set, wearing a leather vest over a thermal shirt, was slumped over the steering wheel and not moving. Tommy's first instinct was to leave. He stood there in the blizzard and let himself feel that instinct honestly, without judgment, because honesty was the only currency he had left. He was injured. He was hypothermic by degrees he couldn't measure. He had 3 granola bars and no shelter and no signal on the prepaid phone in his pocket. Every calculation said walk. Every calculation said that getting tangled in this would use the last of his reserves, and he had nothing left to give without dying. He looked at the 2 small boys. One of them pressed his hand against the window glass. Tommy exhaled a breath he felt in his whole body. He pulled the door handle. Locked. He worked his way around the vehicle to the rear passenger door, the one farthest from the tree, and pulled. It groaned, bent in the frame from the impact, but it moved, grudgingly, the way everything in Tommy's life moved, resistant and damaged, but ultimately not impossible. He got it open wide enough to get his arm in, found the manual lock, released it, pulled. The smell of the interior hit him, motor fluid, shattered plastic, and underneath it something that stunned him, a child's shampoo. The artificial kind, apple-scented, the kind that comes in bottles shaped like cartoon characters. That smell had no business being on a freezing Wyoming mountainside in February, and it hit Tommy somewhere between his lungs and his stomach in a way he wasn't equipped to explain. "Hey!" His voice came out rougher than he intended. "Hey, I'm gonna get you out, okay? Don't move for a second." Neither boy spoke. The one with the blood at his temple was breathing fast and shallow. Tommy checked him first, running his fingers along the sides of the boy's neck and checking his pupils the way he'd learned from a first aid video he'd watched at the public library in Rock Springs 8 months ago, crouched over a library computer while a librarian pretended not to notice a bruised kid teaching himself emergency medicine. Pupils equal, responding to light, responsive to touch. The cut was superficial, already clotting. He checked the other boy. Fine. Scared but physically intact. He tried to reach the driver. The man's pulse was there when Tommy pressed 2 fingers to his neck, slow but present, strong enough to suggest he was unconscious rather than dying, the kind of unconscious that a person could come back from with help. His arm was at a wrong angle. There was blood at his hairline, dried and darkening. Tommy could not move him without risking further injury he didn't know how to anticipate. He made the calculation that nearly broke him. He had to leave the man. He had to take the children. "What are your names?" Tommy asked the boys, working the seatbelt clasp on the first one. Silence. "Okay, that's fine." He got the clasp open, caught the boy as he came loose from the seat, lowered him to the floor. The boy was shaking violently. Tommy pulled his own jacket open and pressed the child against his chest for 30 seconds, feeling the small bodies trembling against his ribs. I'm going to call you Seth. Is that okay? Seth and Luke. He had no idea why those names. They were just the first ones that arrived. The boy looked up at him and said nothing. I'll take that as yes. He got the second boy out the same way. He laid out his emergency blanket on the snow, the foil kind, rustling and inadequate, the kind designed for someone who already had other options, and sat both boys on it while he worked. He used the duct tape from his pocket to wrap the blanket around the smaller child's shoulders like a crude poncho. He tore the sleeve off his thermal underlayer and wrapped the other boy's hands where his gloves were thin and beginning to fail. He used strips from his own jacket lining for their heads. When he was finished, both boys looked at him with expressions he didn't know how to read. Not gratitude exactly. They were too young and too shocked for gratitude. Just something that recognized him as the difference between one thing and another. He pulled out the first granola bar, broke it carefully in half, gave each boy a piece. Eat slow, he said. Don't rush it. He ate nothing himself. He assessed the situation with the stripped-down practicality of someone who has never been allowed the luxury of panic. He had 2 small children who needed warmth and shelter and medical attention. He had a mountainside in a whiteout blizzard. He had his own body, which was already operating somewhere past its rational limits. He had no phone signal, a dead vehicle, and an unconscious man he couldn't move. He looked up the slope. Coming down from above had taken him through a section of the tree line that was thicker. More protection, more cover. There had been a structure of some kind. He had glimpsed the edge of a roof through the snow, dismissed it as an outcropping of rock, but now he reconsidered. Highway maintenance operations kept equipment sheds at intervals along mountain routes. It would be basic shelter. It would be something. He was probably wrong. He went anyway. Okay, he said to the boys. He crouched in front of them, eye level, the way the one decent teacher he'd ever had used to do when she needed him to actually hear her. We're going to walk. I'm going to carry one of you and the other one is going to hold on to me. Can you do that? The smaller boy, Seth, Tommy had decided, reached up and grabbed Tommy's sleeve. That was answer enough. He made the sled from the rear cargo mat he'd found in the SUV, the flat rubberized kind, and he rigged a dragline from the drawstring he pulled out of his own hood. It wasn't engineering, it was desperation shaped like function. He put the larger boy, Luke, on the mat, wrapped the blanket tighter, told him to stay flat and hold the edges. He picked up Seth, and he began to climb. The mountain did not ease up to accommodate them. The wind hit him head-on as they cleared the tree cover, the snow driving horizontally and the temperature dropping another degree every time he exhaled. Seth's weight was bearable. The boy was small, couldn't have been more than 40 pounds. But bearable and easy were different species, and Tommy had not been in the country of easy for a very long time. His arms burned. His shoulders locked into something past ache and into a dull, disconnected pain that he processed as information rather than feeling. Behind him, Luke was silent on the sled, which was either good or terrifying. Tell me about your dad's motorcycles, Tommy said, partly to keep Seth engaged, partly to keep himself present and talking. Seth blinked against the snow. Loud, he said. One word, like a decree. Yeah? How loud? Real loud. A pause. Then, chrome. Chrome. Nice. Tommy shifted the boy's weight to his other arm, kept moving. The slope was gentler here, the footing marginally better where the wind had scoured the surface to something closer to packed ice than loose powder. Marginally. What sound do they make? Seth's mouth formed the shape before the sound came out. Small, breathy, half swallowed by cold and exhaustion. Vroom. Something inside Tommy, some mechanism he had not been aware was still operational, turned over like an engine catching. That's right, he said. Vroom. Keep the bikes running. He said it like a game because it was the only game he had. He said it like a prayer because he had nothing else to offer, and he had long ago stopped believing anything listened when you prayed. But Seth repeated it back to him, and then said it again unprompted, and then Luke said it from the sled, and suddenly there were 3 voices on the mountain saying vroom in the dark and the wind, which was so absurd and so unexpectedly human that Tommy laughed, a real laugh, raw and broken and surprised out of him, and kept climbing. He found the shed. It was smaller than Hope had made it, a low-maintenance structure with corrugated metal walls and a padlocked door, the kind of utilitarian structure that existed purely to contain road salt and equipment and the occasional highway worker's lunch. The padlock was a problem. The padlock was, for 30 seconds, an insurmountable problem, because Tommy had nothing that would cut it and nothing that would pick it, and the wind was accelerating and Seth was shaking in his arms in a way that had moved past shivering and into something more serious. He found a rock. It took 4 strikes. The lock held on the first 3 and gave on the 4th with a crack that he felt in his wrist and didn't stop to assess. He shouldered the door open. Cold, dark interior, smelling of salt and oil and old machinery. 2 snow shovels, a coil of rope, a folded emergency blanket still in its package, better than his, military grade, left behind by someone who didn't know someone would need it here. He got the boys inside. He found a push-lever space heater in the corner, propane-fed, the kind that construction workers used. Half a canister. He got it running on the 3rd try, which was as many tries as he had, and the heat that came off it was meager and imperfect, and the most beautiful thing Tommy had ever felt in his life. He sat the boys against the wall closest to the heater. He wrapped them in the military blanket together, both of them, pressed together for shared heat, 2 small bodies generating warmth between them. He gave them the 2nd granola bar, divided equally. And then Tommy Voss sat down on the frozen concrete floor with his back against the metal wall and felt the weight of everything he had done and everything he still needed to do settle onto him like a second blizzard. His foot was wrong. He couldn't feel the toes on his left foot and hadn't been able to for the last 40 minutes, which was information he was storing rather than reacting to, because reacting used energy he did not have. He had left the man in the vehicle. That thought had a particular texture, not guilt exactly, or not only guilt, but something that understood itself as a choice made in the dark with incomplete information, and wondered if it would look different in the morning, if there was a morning, if the man in the vehicle was still breathing or had stopped in the last hour while Tommy was carrying children up a mountain. He didn't know. He pulled the boys closer to him, one on each side, and felt their warmth against his ribs. "Vroom," Seth said sleepily. "Vroom," Tommy confirmed. "Keep the bikes running." His eyes closed for just a moment. That was all he allowed. Outside, the blizzard was becoming something historic. Meteorologists 60 miles away in Casper were recording wind speeds they hadn't seen in 11 years. The highway had been closed since 6 p.m. Road crews were parked under bridges waiting for visibility. Emergency services had stopped responding to calls they couldn't physically reach. And on the mountain, 3 small heartbeats were continuing inside a maintenance shed that no rescue team knew existed. No one was coming. No one knew to come. Except that 60 miles south, in a low-lit roadhouse called The Forge that smelled like diesel and old leather, a man named Jax Mercer had just received a phone call that had turned his face into something carved from stone, and he stood with the phone still pressed to his ear long after the call ended, and the 23 men in the room with him went silent without being asked. They went silent because they knew that face. They had all seen what came after that face, and every single one of them was already reaching for his keys. The Forge smelled like 40 years of decisions that couldn't be taken back. It was the kind of place that didn't advertise, didn't have a sign you could read from the road, didn't need one. The regulars knew where it was the way they knew where their own scars were, by feel, in the dark, without having to look. The building itself was a converted machine shop on the south edge of Rollins. The corrugated metal exterior painted a brown so dark it disappeared against the winter landscape, 2 industrial lights above the entrance throwing hard yellow cones into the falling snow. Inside, the bar ran the length of the east wall, scarred oak worn smooth by elbows and decades. The tables were mismatched. The chairs were chosen for durability, not comfort. A wood stove in the corner put out the kind of dry, serious heat that didn't ask permission. It was, in the language of men who had long since stopped needing things to be beautiful, exactly enough. Jax Mercer had been standing at the back of the room when the call came in. He was not a small man, 6'2", built across the shoulders like someone who had spent significant portions of his adult life doing things that required a body capable of absorbing consequence. 44 years old with the face of someone who had lived every one of them at full volume, the lines around his eyes deep and earned, the jaw set in a way that hadn't fully relaxed since his 20s. His hair was dark, going gray at the temples, kept short. His beard was 2 weeks past a trim. He wore what he always wore, dark jeans, heavy boots that had resolved arguments with concrete floors on multiple occasions, a thermal underlayer and the cut, the leather vest with the Iron Shepherd patch centered on the back, the bottom rocker reading Wyoming, the president's patch on the front left chest like a brand he'd accepted willingly and carried without complaint for 11 years. The phone had rung at 7:42 p.m. He'd looked at the screen, his sister-in-law Dana, Seth and Luke's aunt, and picked up on the second ring because Dana never called unless the world had changed shape. What she told him in the next 90 seconds rearranged everything. Marcus, his brother-in-law, Dana's husband, the man who had volunteered to drive the boys back from a birthday weekend in Laramie because Jax had a chapter meeting he couldn't reschedule, had missed his check-in call by 2 hours. Dana had called the Highway Patrol. The Highway Patrol had informed her that Route 287 northbound had been closed since 6 p.m. due to a whiteout and that they had no vehicles capable of safely accessing the mountain section until conditions improved. Improved meant morning at earliest, possibly longer. Marcus had last pinged his location at mile marker 94, which put him in the steepest section of the mountain grade. His phone was now going straight to voicemail. Seth and Luke were with him. Jax had listened to all of this without saying a word. When Dana stopped talking, the silence on the line lasted long enough that she said his name twice. He told her he was on it. He told her to stay by the phone. He told her he was going to bring the boys home. And he said it the way men say things they have already decided are true, regardless of what the world thinks. Then he lowered the phone. The room had 23 men in it. Road captains, sergeants at arms, senior members, 3 prospects who had been with the chapter long enough to have earned the right to be in the room during serious conversations. They were mid-meeting, reports half delivered, coffee, going cold, the agenda that now meant absolutely nothing sitting on the table by the bar. Jax didn't raise his voice. He never needed to. Marcus is on 287, mountain grade. Radio silent 2 hours. Seth and Luke are with him. He said nothing else. The room moved. Not dramatically, not with shouting or theater. The men of the Iron Shepherds moved the way they always moved when something real happened, with a compressed, purposeful efficiency that looked from the outside like calm and felt from the inside like a controlled detonation. Chairs scraped back, cuts were straightened, keys came off hooks. Diesel and Preach, the 2 men nearest the door, were already outside before the echo of Jax's words had fully settled. Boone Calloway, the chapter's road captain, and a man who communicated primarily through expressions that covered a vast range of meanings without ever becoming readable to strangers, crossed the room and stopped in front of Jax. "Road's closed," Boone said. "Yes." "Highway Patrol won't go up." "No." Boone looked at him for 2 seconds. "How many you want?" "Everyone who can ride in this." Boone nodded once and walked out. Everyone who can ride in this turned out to be all 23 of them. The phone calls went out in the next 8 minutes. Not just to the Rollins chapter, Jax's reach inside the Iron Shepherds extended to 3 other Wyoming chapters, and his reputation extended considerably further than that. The message was simple, the same way genuine emergencies are always simple. 2 children, mountain road, all hands. Within 20 minutes, phones across the state were lighting up. Within 40, the parking lot outside the forge held 31 motorcycles, and more were coming. The temperature outside was 4 degrees Fahrenheit. The wind chill pushed it to something that the human nervous system experienced as information rather than number. None of that was a conversation anyone was having. Jack stood at the edge of the parking lot while the men assembled around him, his breath making clouds in the frozen air, and he felt the weight of what this was settle into his chest and become something he would carry for the rest of his life, regardless of what happened next. His sons were on that mountain. His brother-in-law was on that mountain. And there was nothing, no law, no weather system, no geographical feature of the American West that was going to keep him on this side of it. He put on his helmet. He started his bike. The sound of 31 Harleys igniting simultaneously in a frozen Wyoming parking lot was the kind of sound that doesn't forget you after you've heard it. It was low and massive and physical, a vibration that moved through the chest cavity and communicated something older than language. The headlights came on in sequence like something coordinated, though nothing had been said, and the convoy began to move out of the lot and onto the highway with the deliberate heavy momentum of something that has already made its peace with what lies ahead. They rode north into the storm. The highway patrol checkpoint was at mile marker 67, two cruisers parked crossways with their light bars going, a concrete barrier supplementing the official road closed signage. A young officer, 26, maybe 28, the kind of earnest that comes before experience sands it into something more complicated, stepped out of his cruiser when he saw the headlights coming and understood what was about to happen approximately 1 second before it happened. Jack stopped his bike 20 feet from the barrier. The convoy stopped behind him, engines still running, 40 headlights illuminating the checkpoint in a hard white wash that left no shadows. The young officer approached. His hand was on his radio, not his weapon, which told Jax he was scared but not stupid. "Road's closed," the officer said. His voice had the quality of a man trying to sound more certain than he felt. "Highway conditions a level 3. I can't let you through." Jax pulled off his helmet. He held it at his side and looked at the officer with an expression that was not threatening in any technical sense and communicated absolute immovability. "My sons are on that mountain," Jack said. 2 5-year-old boys. "My brother-in-law's vehicle went off-road somewhere around mile marker 94. Radio silent 2 hours." The officer's face moved through something. "Sir, I understand that, but where's your supervisor?" "He's coordinating the—" "Get him on the radio." A pause. The young officer keyed his radio. The conversation that followed was brief, tense, and ultimately irrelevant to what was going to happen next, because what was going to happen next had been decided the moment Jax Mercer put on his helmet in that parking lot. 3 minutes later, the radio crackled with something that wasn't quite authorization and wasn't quite a direct order to stand down, and the young officer looked at the 40 headlights behind Jax and made the calculation that some situations exist beyond the jurisdiction of a road closure sign. He moved his cruiser. The convoy went through. They found the guardrail at mile marker 91. Boone was the first one to the edge, his flashlight cutting down the slope through the falling snow, and the beam found the compressed rear end of Marcus's SUV against the tree line below. Jax was off his bike before it stopped moving, his boots hitting the snow, and he went to the edge and looked down, and the breath left him in a way that took several seconds to replace. The vehicle was there. The rear door on the passenger side was open. Jax went down the slope the way he went at everything, directly, without negotiating with the terrain. 3 other men came with him without being asked: Boone, Diesel, and a quiet veteran named Rook, who had spent 8 years doing search and rescue in Colorado before coming to Wyoming for reasons he'd never fully explained. They reached the vehicle in under 2 minutes, boots punching through the snow crust, gloved hands finding purchase where they could. Marcus was in the driver's seat, unconscious, breathing, his arm bent wrong and his face a mask of dried blood, but breathing. Rook went in through the driver's door and had his hands on Marcus's neck and wrists inside 15 seconds. "Pulse is there," Rook said. "Strong. Arms broken. Probable concussion. Maybe a cracked rib from the seatbelt. He needs a hospital, but he's not dying tonight." Jax processed this. Then he registered what was not in the vehicle. The car seats were empty. The seatbelts had been released. He stood in the snow beside the wrecked SUV with a flashlight in his hand and shone it across the surrounding area, and what he found stopped his thinking entirely for 3 full seconds. Tracks. Small ones, child-sized, leading away from the vehicle, and larger ones beside them. Boot prints, a single set, adult but not large, narrow, with an irregular pressure pattern on the left foot suggesting a damaged sole. Someone had been here. Someone had taken the boys. "Jax!" Boone's voice came from 15 feet away, low and careful. He was crouching over something in the snow, his flashlight aimed down. "Come look at this." It was a granola bar wrapper. Foil, neatly folded, not torn. The kind of careful that spoke of someone who didn't have many resources and treated each one with respect. Beside it, barely visible under a fresh layer of snow, a single strip of dark fabric. Jax picked it up. It was insulation material, torn from the lining of a jacket, crude but functional. The kind of improvisation you made when you had nothing and needed something. Someone had been here before the storm got this bad. Someone with almost nothing had taken the time to use what little they had on two children who didn't belong to them. Jack stood in the blizzard and held that strip of fabric and felt something he hadn't felt in a long time, a sensation he didn't have a clean word for. It sat between gratitude and something rawer, something that recognized courage the way veterans recognize each other, by the evidence of what they've survived. "Follow the tracks," he said. The tracks led uphill. That was the thing that got to Jax most. Not sideways, not down toward the road where rescue might be, but uphill, into the harder terrain, the steeper ground. Whoever had taken his sons had made a strategic decision in the worst possible conditions, had identified shelter potential above them rather than below, had carried children uphill in a Wyoming blizzard. That wasn't panic. That wasn't luck. That was someone who had made cold calculations under impossible pressure and come out with the right answer. The drag marks in the snow told him one child had been carried and one had been pulled on some kind of makeshift sled. He could see where the sled had caught on an exposed route and been redirected. The path widened briefly, then corrected. Whoever had done this had adjusted in real time, had kept going when adjusting. It took them 22 minutes to follow the trail up to the maintenance shed. The door was open 3 inches. Faint heat was coming through the gap, visible as a slightly less frozen quality in the air immediately around the opening. Jax pushed the door with one hand and stepped through. The space heater was running on its last quarter of fuel, throwing a cone of orange warmth across the concrete floor. The military blanket was on the left side of the shed, both boys wrapped inside it, pressed together, and for the first moment Jax Mercer was not a president or a protector or a feared man or anything except a father, and he crossed the shed in 3 steps and went to his knees in the concrete and pulled both boys against his chest and held them there in the particular silence of a man who has not yet exhaled from the moment he learned they were gone. Seth said, "Dad?" Luke said, "Vroom." Jax made a sound he would not have been able to describe if asked, and then he became aware of the figure on the floor. The boy was in the far corner of the shed, seated upright against the wall with his knees drawn up and his arms loose at his sides, and he was either asleep or unconscious. The distinction was not immediately clear. He was young, 15, maybe 16, the specific thinness of someone who had not been eating regularly for longer than a few weeks, wearing a jacket that was missing both sleeves and most of its lining. His left boot had a wrapped sole, the duct tape gone dark with moisture. His face, even in sleep, carried something that Jax had seen on his own face in mirrors for the first decade after his discharge. A residual tension in the jaw and brow, the kind that doesn't fully relax because somewhere underneath the sleep, the nervous system is still monitoring for threats. This boy had not been safe long enough to sleep deeply. Jax looked at him for a long moment. Then he looked at his sons, both of whom were looking at the boy with an expression of something serious and certain, the way small children look at things that matter to them, without ambivalence, without the complication that age introduces into every feeling. "He said vroom," Seth announced. "He carried me," Luke added. Then, with the absolute authority of a 5-year-old who has decided something, "He's ours now." Boone appeared in the doorway. He looked at the boys. He looked at the figure in the corner. His expression did a thing it rarely did. It became briefly, completely unguarded. "Who is he?" Boone said quietly. "Don't know yet," Jax said. He crossed the shed and crouched in front of the boy and put 2 fingers against his neck, and the pulse was there, but it was slow, and the skin temperature was alarming. Not just cold, but the specific cold of a body that has been spending its core reserves for hours and is running low on what it has left to spend. Jax checked his extremities. The left hand was normal. The right hand had early discoloration. The left foot, the one with the damaged boot, when Jax carefully removed the boot, he found what he had been afraid he would find. The toes were white, almost waxy, and the skin had that papery texture that meant the tissue had been without adequate circulation long enough to begin the process that could end in permanent damage. "Get the medical kit," Jax said. His voice was flat and specific, the voice he used when the situation required precision and speed rather than conversation. Rook was already through the door. The boy's eyes opened, not gradually, not with the slow emergence of normal waking. They opened all at once, and he was present before Jax could say a word. Fully present, scanning the room with the rapid assessment of someone who has been surprised before and learned that the first seconds matter most. He took in the shed, the bikers, Jax's face at close range, and his body came forward off the wall in a single motion before his damaged foot caught his weight and failed him, and Jax caught him by the shoulder before he hit the concrete. "Easy," Jax said. The boy yanked his arm back immediately, hard. The way you learn to move when arms reaching for you have historically meant something different from help. "The boys," the boy said, first words out of his mouth. Not a question about where he was or who these men were or what was happening. "The boys, are they?" "They're right here." Jax turned so the boy could see Seth and Luke, both of them now standing at Boone's knee regarding the situation with serious eyes. "They're fine. You brought them through." The boy looked at Seth and Luke for a long moment, and something in his face did a thing that Jax watched happen and did not look away from. A loosening, a release of something that had been held at high tension for a long time, and beneath it a confusion that was almost painful to observe, the confusion of someone who has done an enormous thing and cannot yet locate the part of themselves that knows how to receive the acknowledgement of it. "There's a man in the vehicle," the boy said. "Down the slope. I couldn't move him. His arm—" "We found him. He's alive. My men are with him." The boy absorbed this. His jaw worked once, something releasing. "Good," he said, a single syllable carrying a weight that Jax felt across the distance between them. "What's your name?" Jax asked. A pause. Not the pause of someone who doesn't know their name, but the pause of someone deciding how much to hand over. "Tommy," the boy said finally. "Tommy." Jax held the name briefly. "I'm Jax. Those are my sons. The man in the truck is their uncle." He stopped. Then, "You carried my kids up a mountain in a blizzard." Tommy said nothing. He was sitting on the concrete floor with his back against the wall and one boot off, and 40 years of controlled damage looking at him from 10 feet away. And he met Jax's eyes with the directness of someone who has learned that looking away invites worse things than whatever you're looking at. "I heard them," Tommy said. Like that explained everything. And somehow it did. Rook came back through the door with the medical kit and a wool blanket from one of the saddlebags, and he didn't ask permission before crouching beside Tommy and beginning to assess the foot, and Tommy's whole body went rigid at the uninvited proximity. "I'm going to look at your foot," Rook said. Not asking, not commanding, just stating the fact in the specific tone of someone who has talked people through being touched when they don't want to be touched. "You've got frostbite. I need to see how bad." Tommy looked at him. At the hands. At the face. The assessment took 3 seconds. "Fine," he said, but his hands were flat against the concrete at his sides, and his shoulders were at a height that meant they had not dropped since he woke up. And Jax saw all of it and filed it away in a part of himself that recognized the posture from the inside. Rook worked quickly and quietly, and what he found when he had both hands on the foot and his penlight out made his expression go carefully neutral in the way that meant what he was seeing was not good, but survivable. "He needs a hospital," Rook said to Jax. "Tonight." "I know." "The foot—" "I know." Jax looked at Tommy. "We're going to take you down the mountain. You understand?" "I don't need—" Tommy started. "Your foot is frostbitten and you're hypothermic." Jax said it without inflection. "Facts." "You've been in sub-zero conditions for—" He looked at the boy. "How long have you been out here?" Tommy's mouth closed. Jax looked at the jacket without sleeves, the duct-taped boot, the granola bar wrappers. 2 of them, he now saw, both empty, on the floor near where the boys had been sitting. He looked at the bruise above Tommy's left eye, the kind of bruise that had a fist-shaped origin and was several days old, which meant it predated the storm. He felt something moving in his chest, something that made his jaw tighten. "Where are your parents?" he asked. Tommy looked at the wall to his left. "Not a factor," he said. The silence that followed had a specific texture that Boone recognized from the doorway, and Rook recognized from the floor, and even Seth and Luke, too young to understand the words, seemed to feel, because Seth moved across the shed and sat down beside Tommy and leaned against his arm without being invited. Tommy went completely still, like something that doesn't know what to do with gentle. Jax watched this and felt the thing in his chest become something with edges. "Okay," Jax said quietly. "We're going down." Getting Marcus out of the vehicle took 11 men, 2 lengths of recovery rope, and 35 minutes in deteriorating visibility. They built a splint for his arm from a snow shovel handle and the nylon from a saddlebag strap. Rook monitored his vitals throughout. He came around once, briefly, enough to say Jax's name in a thick, confused voice, and Jax told him to be still and that everything was handled, and Marcus had apparently decided to believe him because he went quiet again. They carried Marcus out on an improvised litter made from leather vests buttoned together. 4 vests, 4 men, moving in coordinated silence up the slope toward the road while the blizzard did what it wanted to the world around them. Tommy refused to be carried. He said it once, flat and final, and Jax looked at him for a beat and nodded, and Rook gave him a wrapped chemical heat pack for each hand and a better boot replacement fashioned from a thermal sock and a saddlebag cover secured with bungee cord, and Tommy walked. Slowly. With Rook on his left and Diesel, a man whose name perfectly suited his 6'4" silence, on his right, not touching him, not guiding him, just present in the specific way that meant if he went down, someone would catch him. He didn't go down. Seth rode on Jax's back all the way to the road, and the boy spent the whole climb with his face pressed into Jax's shoulder, saying vroom at irregular intervals into the wind. At the road, the situation had changed. 4 more Iron Shepherd bikes had arrived, plus 2 pickup trucks with members who couldn't safely ride in these conditions. There was also now an ambulance. Highway Patrol had finally managed to get a vehicle through from the Rollins side, chains on all 4 wheels, the paramedics inside looking at the assembled bikers with the professional neutrality of people who had long ago learned to focus on patients rather than context. They took Marcus. They took Tommy. Tommy didn't argue about the ambulance, which told Jax more than anything else the boy had said. He was past arguing. He sat on the gurney while a paramedic put an oxygen mask on him and started an IV line, and he looked out the back window of the ambulance at Jax standing in the snow, and his expression was the expression of someone trying to read a situation they don't have the vocabulary for yet. Jax held up one hand. Not a wave, just an acknowledgement. "I see you." The ambulance doors closed. Jax stood in the snow with Seth at his feet, and Luke held against his chest and watched the ambulance move south through the convoy of headlights. And he thought about a jacket without sleeves and duct-taped boots, and a boy who had given every piece of warmth he carried to 2 children he didn't know. He thought about the bruise above the left eye. He thought about not a factor. Boone appeared at his shoulder, the way Boone always appeared, without announcement, without theater, just suddenly present. Boone lit a cigarette and held it for a moment without smoking it. "Kid's got no one," Boone said. It wasn't a question. "Feels that way." "What are you thinking?" Jax looked at the road ahead where the ambulance had gone. The taillights were 2 red points in the white, getting smaller. "I'm thinking we owe a debt," Jax said. Boone smoked. "We gonna pay it?" The question hung in the frozen air between them. Jax looked at his sons, at Seth, who was holding the hem of Jax's jacket in both fists, and at Luke, who had fallen asleep against his shoulder with the absolute trust of a child who has been returned to safety and doesn't need to think about it anymore. "We're going to pay it," Jax said. But what Jax didn't know, what none of them knew as the convoy began its slow descent off the mountain, was that paying a debt to Tommy Voss was going to require something considerably more complicated than showing up at a hospital with a gift and a grateful handshake. Because Tommy's disappearance from the Henderson foster home had been logged 6 hours ago. Because the Wyoming Department of Family Services had a protocol for runaway foster children. Because there were systems in place, interlocking and impersonal, designed with the specific architecture of institutions that served liability first and children a distant second. And because Dale Henderson, when he woke up that morning and found Tommy gone, had made a phone call that had less to do with concern for the boy's safety and everything to do with a man who did not like the particular vulnerability of having a witness to his behavior, walk out his back door into a blizzard. The call Henderson had made was not to family services. It was to someone who owed him a favor. And somewhere between the mountain and the hospital, that favor was already in motion. The kind that moved in the specific dark of systems designed to look like help, while functioning as something else entirely. Something that understood Tommy Voss not as a child who needed protecting, but as a piece of unfinished business that had inconveniently survived the night. The ambulance reached Rollins Memorial at 11:47 p.m. Tommy was already unconscious again when they brought him in. And in the waiting room, before Jax had even dismounted his bike in the hospital parking lot, before the convoy had fully arrived, a man in a county-issued jacket with a lanyard and a clipboard was already seated in the molded plastic chair nearest the emergency entrance. And he was not there because he cared about the boy who had carried 2 children through a blizzard. He was there because Dale Henderson had called in his favor, and he was there to make sure that when Tommy Voss woke up, the boy would understand exactly how much of what had happened tonight could be made to look like something other than rescue. He was there to take Tommy back. The man with the clipboard had a name tag that read Garfield, K, and a face that had learned to arrange itself into expressions of bureaucratic concern the way other faces learn to smile, through repetition, without feeling, until the muscle memory replaced the original intention entirely. He was maybe 50, soft in the jaw, hard in the eyes. The county jacket he wore was the color of institutional beige, the kind of color chosen specifically to communicate nothing, to be forgettable, to slide past the attention of anyone looking for something to react to. His shoes were clean despite the weather, which meant he had driven here and walked from the parking structure and had not spent any meaningful time in the elements tonight. His clipboard held a single form, the top edge of which had been folded back to obscure the header, which was a small thing, a minor thing, but Tommy Voss had spent 6 years learning to read small things. He was reading this one from the gurney in Bay 3 of Rollins Memorial's emergency wing, with an IV line in his right arm and a heated blanket over his legs and a pulse oximeter on his left index finger, and the reading he was getting from the man with the clipboard was making the spaces between his shoulder blades go tight in a way that had nothing to do with hypothermia. The ER was controlled chaos at a low frequency. Wheels on linoleum, muffled PA, the specific chemical smell of a place that processed bodies in crisis. A curtain divided Tommy's bay from the one beside it, where he could hear nurses moving with purpose and a doctor giving instructions in the compressed shorthand of people who needed language to work faster than language usually did. Marcus, probably. Or someone else from the mountain. It didn't matter right now, because what mattered right now was Garfield, K., who had placed himself in the chair beside the bed without asking and was now looking at his clipboard with the expression of someone about to perform a task they have performed many times and no longer think of as involving a human being. Thomas Voss, Garfield said. Not a question. Confirming a number on an inventory sheet. Tommy said. Garfield wrote something. 15 DOB March 4th. Currently placed with Dale and Renee Henderson Rollins. He looked up. Except you're not, are you? Tommy said nothing. He held the silence the way he had learned to hold things that could be taken from him if he wasn't careful. You left the Henderson residence without authorization. Garfield turned a page on his clipboard, not folding it back enough for Tommy to see. Approximately 1700 hours yesterday. Mr. Henderson reported your absence to this office at 2300. 6 hours. Dale had waited 6 hours before making the call. Tommy absorbed that, filed it. There was information in that gap. Not concern, not parental alarm, but calculation. A man who waited 6 hours before reporting a missing child in a blizzard was a man who had spent those 6 hours deciding what version of events served him best. I see, Tommy said. Do you? Garfield set the clipboard on his knee. His tone had not changed. Because, from where I sit, you're a runaway, which creates a particular kind of paperwork situation, especially given that you were found in a state requiring emergency medical care outside your place of residence, having apparently taken it upon yourself to, he paused, a precise and deliberate pause, wander into a restricted mountain area during a weather event. Wander. The word landed in Tommy's chest with a specific weight. I saved 2 children, Tommy said. Flat. No inflection, just the fact. That's being assessed, Garfield said. What I need from you right now is... Who called you? Tommy said. Who specifically called you tonight? Something moved in Garfield's face. Not much. A tightening around the eyes. A microscopic recalibration. Standard protocol when a minor in state care presents at an emergency. Who called you? Tommy said again. Same volume. Same flatness. He had learned, through long practice, that repeating a question in exactly the same tone was more unsettling than raising your voice. Raised voices could be dismissed as emotional. This could not be dismissed as anything. Garfield looked at him for 3 seconds. Then he looked at his clipboard. You'll be remanded to temporary transitional placement pending review, he said. Given the circumstances, the Henderson home is not the appropriate setting for... I'm not going to any placement tonight, Tommy said. Mr. Voss, I have frostbite on 3 toes and a core temperature that your nurse told me 40 minutes ago was 89 degrees when I came in. Tommy kept his eyes on Garfield's face. I'm not going anywhere until a doctor discharges me. Garfield put his pen to the clipboard. That's ultimately not your decision. Then whose decision is it? The state of Wyoming's, as it pertains to minors and... Get out of my bay, Tommy said. The silence that followed was the kind that comes just before something breaks. Garfield did not get out. He shifted in his chair and crossed one leg over the other and assumed the posture of a man who has institutional weight behind him and knows it, who has learned that the institutional weight is usually enough, who has rarely needed anything else because the people he dealt with were usually too broken or too young or too far from their own power to push back effectively. He had not correctly assessed Tommy Voss. Before either of them spoke again, the curtain moved. Jax Mercer came through it without asking permission, the way Jax moved through most things, and the change in the atmospheric pressure of the small bay was immediate and physical. He was still in his riding gear, snow melting off his shoulders, his face carrying the particular expression he wore when he had come a long way through difficult conditions and was not in the mood to encounter additional obstacles. Behind him, close enough to be deliberate, stood Boone, who said nothing and required nothing to be understood. Garfield looked at the leather cut, at the patch, at the president's bar. His expression did a thing that was not quite fear and not quite composure and landed somewhere between them. Jax looked at Garfield. Then he looked at Tommy. You okay? He said, not performing concern, just asking. This man is trying to remand me to transitional placement, Tommy said. Tonight. Jax looked back at Garfield. He looked at him the way he looked at things that needed to be taken apart and understood before they could be dealt with. Garfield held the look for approximately 4 seconds before something in his spine made a decision independent of his face. Mr. Garfield started. Mercer, Jax said. Jax Mercer. He let the name sit there. A pause. Recognition moved through Garfield's face in a way he couldn't fully control. Not of Jax personally, but of the weight the name carried in certain circles in Wyoming. The specific gravity of a man who had been the subject of law enforcement attention for a decade and had never been successfully charged with anything because he was meticulous and careful, and because most of what people believed about the Iron Shepherds was considerably more dramatic than the reality, which was men with records and damage and a code that predated the one printed in county employee handbooks. This is a child welfare matter, Garfield said carefully. It's outside the scope of... The child you're discussing, Jax said, carried my sons through a blizzard tonight and nearly died doing it. His foot may require surgery. His core temperature when he arrived here was 89 degrees. And you're sitting in that chair at midnight on a Wednesday, which tells me someone called you specifically, not that a protocol was triggered. Garfield's jaw moved. No words came. Who called you? Jax asked. The same question Tommy had asked, the same flatness. I'm not at liberty to... Dale Henderson, Tommy said quietly. Both men looked at him. Tommy was watching Garfield's face with the focused attention of someone reading a text in a language they've spent years learning. Henderson called you, not Family Services Dispatch, you specifically. He has your direct number, which means you have a relationship outside of whatever this is supposed to be. He stopped. How many times has he called you directly about a kid who was placed with him? The silence that followed was not empty. It was full of the specific texture of a thing being understood in real time, a thing that had been present all along but had required the right angle of light to become visible. Garfield stood up. "This conversation is outside appropriate channels," he said. His voice had recovered its professional register, but the recovery was slightly too fast, slightly too performed. "Mr. Voss, I'll return in the morning with—" "You'll return in the morning with a lawyer," Jack said. "Because if you come back without one, I'll be bringing mine." Garfield looked at him. "He's 15, Garfield said. "That's right," Jack said. "He is." Garfield left. The curtain settled behind him, and the bay felt different without him in it. Larger, or maybe just cleaner, the way rooms feel when something that was taking up invisible space has been removed. Tommy exhaled slowly, feeling the breath move through his chest, feeling the specific ache of someone whose body has been in emergency mode for a long time and is beginning to register what it cost. Jack sat down in the chair Garfield had vacated, not asking, just sitting, the way a man sits when he has decided the conversation is going to continue and is organizing himself for it. "Tell me about Henderson," he said. Tommy looked at the ceiling. "Nothing to tell." "Tommy." "Nothing I'm going to tell you." He moved his eyes from the ceiling to Jax's face. "We just met." Jax held the look. He had a quality, Tommy was registering it slowly, adding it to the assessment he was building of this man, of being completely comfortable with silences that would make most people speak to fill them. He just sat in them, like they were neutral territory. "Fair," Jack said finally. You don't owe me anything." "No," Tommy said. "I don't. But I'm going to find out anyway," Jack said. Not a threat. Just a fact. Stated with the matter-of-fact quality of a man who has learned that information about situations that affect him eventually surfaces one way or another. "Henderson has a placement history. That's public record once I know to look for it." Tommy said nothing. "How long was he hurting you?" Jack said. The monitor beside the bed registered a change in Tommy's heart rate. Just a small one, just enough. 7 weeks, Tommy said. Eventually, like it cost something. Jax's jaw tightened once and released, a single controlled movement. "And Garfield?" "I don't know what Garfield is to him, but Henderson waited 6 hours to make the call. That's not how you report a missing kid." Tommy looked at the IV line in his arm. "That's how you call someone to make sure the story is straight before anyone official starts asking questions." Boone, from the curtain, made a sound that was not quite a word. Jax didn't look at him. "What story?" Jack said. "I don't know yet," Tommy said. "But there is one. There's always one." The conversation ended there because a doctor came in. Early 40s, Dr. Reyes on her badge, the specific competent efficiency of someone who is going to do her job regardless of the 2 large men in leather vests sitting in her patient's bay, and began the assessment that would determine what the next several hours looked like for Tommy's left foot. She asked Jax and Boone to step outside with a look that communicated it was not a request, and they went, and the curtain closed, and Tommy was alone with the lights and the monitor and the antiseptic smell and the sound of his own breathing. The assessment took 20 minutes. The news, when Dr. Reyes delivered it, had the quality of all bad news that contains a margin. The toes were frostbitten, the tissue damaged, but they had caught it early enough that the prognosis was not amputation, was not permanent disfigurement, was instead a painful period of monitored rewarming and a recovery process that would take weeks and require follow-up and care that was not available in a transitional placement facility with rotating staff and institutional food and a bed that might be in a different county next week. She did not say this last part, but Tommy heard it underneath what she did say, because he had spent 6 years learning to hear the things that were said underneath what was said. "Where will you be staying?" Dr. Reyes asked, her pen over her form. Tommy opened his mouth. Outside the curtain, a voice he recognized made a sound. Boone's voice, low and specific, not intended for Tommy to hear. And then Jax's voice answering, and then another voice Tommy didn't recognize, harder, official. A voice that carried the particular tone of someone who has the weight of a system behind them and knows it. A different voice than Garfield. Worse, somehow. Tommy pushed back his heated blanket. "Stay in the bed," Dr. Reyes said without looking up from her form. "Who's out there?" Tommy said. She looked up at him. Her expression shifted in a way that doctors learn to control and rarely fully achieve. The shift of someone who has information they are not at liberty to volunteer, and who is aware that the person across from them is intelligent enough to notice the containment. "There are some people here to speak with you," she said carefully. "What people?" "I think you should—" "What people?" Tommy said again. She set her pen down. "A caseworker and a county sheriff's deputy," she said, "regarding your placement status." Tommy was off the bed before the sentence was finished. Not running. His foot wouldn't allow running, and his body wouldn't allow what running would have required. But he was standing, which was its own kind of statement, and he was pulling the IV line from his arm. The wrong way to do it. Dr. Reyes made a sharp sound of protest. And the heated blanket was on the floor, and he was in the hospital gown and the modified boot, and the cold air of the corridor was already hitting him when the curtain swung open and the deputy was there. Not aggressive, not violent, just present, in the way that authority is present, a body in a doorway, a hand on a belt, a face with the expression of someone who has a piece of paper that makes his position unambiguous. "Thomas Voss," the deputy said. "I know," Tommy said. He stopped. He didn't fight. He had learned young that fighting a deputy in a hospital corridor with no shoes and an IV site bleeding on his arm produced a specific outcome, and it was not a good one. He stopped. And in the stopping, in that particular stillness of a person who has run out of corridor, he felt something he recognized from every group home and emergency placement and caseworker's back seat and courtroom waiting room of his life. The sensation of the walls coming in, the architecture of systems designed to process him, rather than protect him, closing around him with the impersonal efficiency of something that wasn't cruel, just indifferent, which was always worse. Jax was 6 feet away. He was looking at Tommy with an expression that Tommy could not fully decode because he did not have the reference points to decode it. It was not pity, was not the calculated compassion of someone performing concern, was not the complicated mixture of guilt and relief that adults who failed children sometimes wore when confronted with the evidence. It was something older and simpler than any of those things, something that recognized the moment for what it was. "Don't," Tommy said to him. He didn't know exactly what he was saying don't to. Don't make promises. Don't intervene. Don't look at me like I'm worth saving because I don't know what to do with that. And it will cost you something I can't repay, and I have been here before and it always ends the same way. Jax didn't look away. "Boone," he said quietly. Boone was already on his phone. The deputy moved forward. He was not unkind. He put one hand on Tommy's elbow, gentle, the way they trained them to be with minors, the gentleness that was still a grip, that still had direction and intention behind it. And Tommy let himself be moved because the alternative was a charge on a record that would follow him past 18 into every apartment application and job interview and chance at something different. He walked. The waiting room was not a large room. It held the molded plastic chairs and the bad lighting and the institutional carpet and the particular psychic weight of all the waiting that had been done there by people in various states of crisis. It held now 21 bikers. They were seated, some of them, and standing, others, arranged around the perimeter of the space with the patient immovability of men who have made a collective decision and are not going to explain it or defend it or negotiate it. They were not blocking the exits. They were not threatening anyone. They were just there, filling the room with leather and engine grease and the specific gravity of men who have been through things and are still standing because standing is what they do. The deputy stopped. The caseworker, a woman this time, different from Garfield, wearing the same institutional beige in a slightly different configuration, stopped beside the deputy and looked at the room and performed a recalculation that was visible in her face. "This is a county medical facility," she said. To no one in particular. "Yes, ma'am," said Rook from the chair nearest the window. He said nothing else. She looked at Jax. "Mr. Mercer," she said. Her voice had the quality of someone who has done research in the last 20 minutes. "I'm aware of who you are. I'm also aware that what's happening right now constitutes—" "A group of people sitting in a waiting room," Jack said, "which is what waiting rooms are for. The minor has a legal right to medical treatment before being transferred to any facility," Jack said, "which his doctor has not yet cleared. You'll want to check on that." The woman looked at the deputy. The deputy looked at Jax. The room held its breath with the collective patience of 21 men who had learned through various hard educations that patience, applied correctly, was more effective than force. Tommy stood in the doorway of the waiting room and looked at the space full of people who had ridden through a blizzard to find two children who mattered to them and who were now sitting in plastic chairs at midnight in a hospital waiting room for reasons that had nothing to do with their own children and everything to do with something they had decided, without deliberation, without being asked. He looked at this. He had no framework for it. He had a framework for institutions that processed him. A framework for adults who meant well and failed him anyway. A framework for the specific architecture of being handed from one system to the next like an object requiring routing. He did not have a framework for 21 men choosing to be in the same room with him because they decided he was worth choosing. Seth appeared from behind Jax's left side. The boy crossed the waiting room with the absolute directness of a 5-year-old who has identified the thing he needs and is going to it without apology. And he walked up to Tommy and took Tommy's hand and held it. Tommy looked down at him. Seth looked up. "Vroom," Seth said. Serious. Like a password. Something in Tommy's chest cracked. Not broke. Cracked. The difference being that cracks let things through. And what came through was not something he could name or contain or look at directly. He crouched down, awkwardly, his damaged foot making the motion difficult. And he looked at Seth at eye level. And he said, "Vroom." Seth nodded, satisfied, held Tommy's hand tighter, and that was the moment that the caseworker, whose name was Patricia Helms, and who had been doing this job for 14 years, and who had processed many children through many systems, and had learned the specific professional distance required to do so without it destroying her, felt something shift in her chest in a way she was going to have to examine later, privately, away from her professional capacity. "The medical clearance," she said to Dr. Reyes, who had followed the group to the waiting room with the expression of a woman watching something unfold that is outside her normal clinical territory. "How long?" "Until I determine he's stable enough for transfer," Dr. Reyes said. "The foot requires monitoring for the next 6 to 8 hours minimum." "And in your professional assessment," Helms said carefully, "what constitutes the appropriate continuity of care?" Dr. Reyes said. "Warm environment. Medical follow-up at 48 and 72 hours. Someone responsible present to monitor for complications." She looked at the room. "Someone consistent." Helms looked at Jax. Jax looked at her. "I can provide that," he said. "Mr. Mercer, you are not a licensed foster—" "I know what I'm not," Jax said. "I'm also the father of the 2 children this boy saved. And I have a home with heat and food and a spare bedroom. And I have a lawyer who will be here by 7 a.m. And I have the name of a placement advocacy organization in Cheyenne whose director owes me a significant favor. And I have the beginning of a very serious conversation about why a county official named Garfield arrived at this hospital within 40 minutes of a runaway child being admitted at midnight, specifically at the request of a foster parent with a history I am currently having researched." The silence that followed was the longest one of the night. Helms looked at her own clipboard. She looked at the deputy. She looked at the room full of bikers and the doctor and the 2 small boys who had both now installed themselves on either side of Tommy and were leaning against him with the certainty of children who have decided where they belong. "Temporary medical custodianship," Helms said. She said it slowly, like she was testing the weight of the words before committing to them. "Pending review. 48 hours. 48 hours, Jack said. "You understand this is provisional." "I understand. And there will be a home visit." "Whenever you want." Helms wrote something on her clipboard. Her face was the face of a woman who was doing something that was technically within her authority and felt simultaneously right and terrifying, the way most genuinely correct decisions do. The deputy uncuffed his hands from his belt. Tommy felt the specific sensation of a held breath releasing from his entire body. Not safety, not yet, not the real kind that came from time and consistency and the slow accumulation of evidence that a place was going to hold, but the immediate physical sensation of a particular immediate danger having stepped back. Just a step. Just enough. He was still in the hospital gown, still had Seth's hand in his, still had 3 damaged toes and a record and nowhere permanent to go, and a caseworker who would be back in 48 hours with the full weight of the state behind her. But he was not tonight being put in a car driven by someone with a clipboard who would take him somewhere with a locked door and a rotating staff and a bed that had held 12 other broken children before him. Tonight, he was staying, which was not safety, but was adjacent to it in a way he had not been adjacent to it in a very long time. He was about to exhale the last of the tension from his shoulders when Rook appeared from the far corner of the waiting room. He had been on his phone for the last 12 minutes. Tommy had registered it peripherally. The low voice, the pauses, the specific quality of a man receiving information and processing it without reaction. He came across the room and stopped in front of Jack's, and his face, which was generally about as readable as granite, had done something that Tommy had not yet seen it do. It had gone still. Not the normal still of a man who doesn't waste expression, but the particular stillness of a man who has received information that has changed the shape of the room. "Got something," Rook said quietly to Jax. Jax looked at him. "Henderson," Rook said. "Before Rollins, before Tommy." A pause. There were two others. The words fell into the room with the weight of something that had been buried and had been found. "Two other kids?" Jax said. Rook shook his head. "Two other placements. Over 4 years." He paused again. "Both removed after emergency medical presentations." He held Jax's eyes. "Both listed in the records as accidental." Tommy was listening. He had been listening the way he always listened, fully, quietly, from behind an expression that gave nothing away. And what he heard in Rook's voice was not just the information but the shape of it, the implications that radiated outward from it like cracks from an impact point. This was not about Tommy. This had never only been about Tommy. He thought about Garfield's direct number in Dale Henderson's phone. He thought about a county official who arrived at midnight without being dispatched through normal channels. He thought about the 6-hour gap between his disappearance and the call, which was not 6 hours of a man deciding what story to tell. It was 6 hours of a man making calls to people who already knew the story, who had already helped shape it before, who were already positioned to shape it again. A network. Not a conspiracy in the dramatic sense, just the older, quieter, more durable conspiracy of people in adjacent positions of authority who covered for each other because covering was easier than accountability, and because the people they covered for and the people they covered against were not in the same category of human in their working assessment of the world. Tommy thought about the two children in the records listed as accidental. He thought about his own body, his ribs from week 3, the bruise above his eye from day 19, the specific architecture of damage applied by someone who knew where to apply it and how to explain it away. He thought about what it would take to get that to matter to the right people. He thought about what those people would need to see. And he thought about the thing he had carried in his shoe for 6 years, the birthday card from Marcus Webb, cousin of his mother, the man who had said, "If you ever need anything, find me." The man who was currently in a hospital bay 30 feet away with a broken arm and a concussion. The man Tommy had been walking toward when the storm changed everything. Marcus Webb, who was married to Dana. Dana, who was the sister-in-law of Jax Mercer. The shape of it assembled itself in Tommy's mind with the slow, inevitable clarity of something that had been true all along waiting to be seen. He had not been walking randomly through a Wyoming mountain in a blizzard. He had been walking to this family. The coincidence of it, if it was a coincidence, if that word still applied when the threads were this close and this tangled, sat in his chest like a stone he didn't know what to do with, too heavy to carry easily and too important to put down. "Jax," Tommy said. His voice came out differently than he intended, less controlled, something underneath the flatness surfacing without permission. Jax turned to him. "The man in the truck," Tommy said. "Marcus, what's his last name?" A pause. "Webb," Jax said. "Marcus Webb. He married my wife's sister." Tommy looked at him. "I have a card in my boot," Tommy said. "The right one. It's been there 6 years." He stopped. "Your brother-in-law sent it to me when I was 9 years old." The room went the specific quiet of a space where a sentence has been said that changes what kind of room it is. Jax looked at him with an expression that was moving through several states in rapid succession and arriving somewhere that had no clean name. "Say that again," Jax said quietly. Marcus Webb, Tommy said. He's related to my mother. Was. She's gone. He said it without effect. The way you say things you have said to yourself so many times they've become data rather than wound. He sent me a birthday card. Told me to find him if I needed anything. A pause. The longest pause of the night. I was walking to Casper to find him. Outside, through the waiting room's single window facing the parking structure, the sky was beginning to show the first gray suggestion of dawn in the east. Pale and cold, and offering no warmth yet but present. The simple, stubborn fact of another day arriving whether or not anyone was ready for it. The blizzard was not finished. And in the parking lot of Rollins Memorial, a car that had been idling since 11:30 p.m., a county-issue sedan, the engine running, the driver, a man Tommy did not yet know the name of, was about to receive a phone call from Dale Henderson that was going to change the calculation of the next 48 hours in ways that no one in that waiting room was yet prepared for. Because Henderson had not made one call tonight. He had made 4. And only one of them had gone to Garfield. The other 3 had gone to people with the kind of reach that did not appear in public records. People who understood that a 15-year-old boy with no guardian and no fixed address and a documented history of running was not a child who had witnesses, was not a child who had advocates, was not a child the system would miss if the paperwork routed him somewhere it was very difficult to route back from. 3 calls. 3 people who were now in motion. And the 48 hours that Jax Mercer had just secured for Tommy Voss were about to become the most dangerous 48 hours of a life that had already been full of dangerous ones. The car in the parking lot moved at 5:47 a.m. Rook saw it from the waiting room window. The county-issue sedan, dark blue, the kind of vehicle that existed to be unnoticed, pulling slowly toward the exit with its headlights off. He watched it for 3 seconds. Then he crossed the room and touched Jax's shoulder once, the specific single contact that meant look at this without reacting visibly. Jax looked. The car reached the exit, paused, and turned north. That's the 3rd time it's moved, Rook said quietly. Been circling since 2 a.m. Different lot each time. Plates? Wyoming County Fleet. Called in the number 40 minutes ago. Comes back to a vehicle pool registered to the Department of Child and Family Integration. He paused. Which is not the same department as the caseworker tonight. Different division entirely. Jax looked at the window for another second. Then he looked at Boone. Boone was already moving. The next hour happened in the specific, compressed way that hours happened when men who had spent significant portions of their adult lives navigating situations with incomplete information and high consequences began working a problem. Rook's contact, a woman named Selah, who did paralegal work for 3 law firms in Cheyenne and had a secondary understanding of Wyoming state agency structures that she had never put on a resume, had been on the phone since 2:30 a.m. By 6:15, she had assembled something. The Department of Child and Family Integration was real and bureaucratically legitimate, a subdivision of a larger state welfare umbrella that handled, among other things, the coordination between county placement services and a network of private residential facilities. The facilities in the network were licensed, inspected on paper, and had passed every review they'd been subject to because the reviews were conducted by inspectors who were assigned from a roster maintained by. And here was where Selah's voice had gone careful and flat in the way voices went when the thing being described was larger than expected. A director whose tenure had coincided exactly with a 14% increase in the number of children placed in network facilities versus independent foster homes, and whose brother-in-law operated 2 of those facilities, both of which received state per diem payments for every child placed within them. The facilities were not, as far as Selah had been able to determine in 4 hours of middle-of-the-night research, actively abusive. They were something quieter and more durable than that. They were places where children without advocates went and stayed and aged out and dispersed without anyone tracking what happened to them afterward, because tracking required resources, and resources required prioritization, and the prioritization belonged to the people who controlled the roster. Dale Henderson was not the system. Dale Henderson was a symptom, a pressure valve, a man who took in children the system needed somewhere to put, held them long enough for the paperwork to process, and when they became inconvenient, when they ran or reported or became the wrong kind of visible, made a call that rerouted them somewhere they would be considerably less visible. 2 previous placements, both removed after emergency medical presentations, both redirected afterward to network facilities. Neither one currently findable in the public record. Jack sat with this information in the waiting room at 6:20 a.m. and felt the specific cold that had nothing to do with temperature move through him. The cold of understanding that what he was looking at was not a bad man with a bad habit, but a mechanism, something with moving parts and institutional lubrication and the kind of longevity that came from being useful to the right people in the right places. He had Tommy on a 48-hour provisional arrangement. The clock had started at 11:52 p.m., which meant he had until approximately midnight tomorrow before Patricia Helms came back with her clipboard and her authority and whatever had been arranged in the meantime. He went to the room where Tommy was. Tommy was awake. He had not slept. He was sitting up in the hospital bed with the lights at half and his foot in the thermal monitoring wrap the nurses had applied at 3 a.m., and his eyes tracking the ceiling in the particular way of someone who has been running calculations for hours. He looked at Jax when Jax came in, and his expression did not change, but his attention sharpened. "You found something," Tommy said. "Some things," Jax said. He sat down. "Tell me about the other placements. Before Henderson." Tommy was quiet for a moment. "There were 3. Before Henderson." "What happened at them?" "First one, the guy had a drinking problem. I reported it. Got moved." He said it without color, without the performance of trauma, just the sequential facts of a life documented in files. Second one was fine for 4 months, and then the woman got sick and the placement ended. Third one, the family moved out of state and didn't want to navigate the transfer paperwork. A pause. Henderson was a month after that. Did any of the families before Henderson have contact with a county official outside normal channels? Someone who showed up at specific times? Tommy looked at the ceiling again. The look of someone cross-referencing. "Third placement," he said slowly. "When the family moved, there was a man who came to the house twice before the move was finalized. He wasn't the regular caseworker. He had a different jacket." He stopped. "Beige." Jax felt the thing in his chest tighten. "And he spoke to the family privately," Tommy said. "Both times. And both times afterward, the family seemed less interested in pursuing the transfer paperwork." He turned his eyes from the ceiling to Jax's face. "I thought they just didn't want the hassle. But, Jax said, but if someone was telling them the transfer would be complicated, that there was a simpler option, that they could just..." He stopped. "They would have believed it. People believe things that make their lives easier." "How long ago?" 8 months. Jax looked at his hands. He was wearing a ring on his right hand. Not a wedding ring, just a band of dark metal, something he'd worn for years, and he turned it once with his thumb, the way he turned problems. "Tommy, the card from Marcus." He looked up. "Do you still have it?" Tommy reached down beside the bed. His right boot was on the floor, and he reached into it and came out with a card that had been folded and unfolded so many times the paper had softened at the creases to something approaching fabric. He held it out. Jax took it carefully. He opened it, read it, turned it over. Read the back. On the back, in handwriting that had not been in the card when Marcus sent it, added later, in a different pen, in the handwriting of a child who was learning to write carefully, were 3 lines. A date, an address in Rollins, and a name that was not Marcus's name. The name was Garfield. K. Jax looked up. "You wrote this," he said. "When I was at the 3rd placement," Tommy said. "The man who came to the house. I got his name off the lanyard. I wrote it down somewhere I knew I'd always have it." A beat. "I didn't know what I was writing it down for. I just knew it mattered." Jax held the card. Outside the hospital, the dawn was fully present now, cold and clear, the blizzard having spent itself sometime in the last hour, leaving behind a landscape of deep white silence and the specific blue-edged light of a Wyoming morning after heavy snow. The parking lot held still 17 motorcycles. The men who had ridden through the night were there, some in their bikes, engines off, sitting in the cold with the patience of men who have learned to wait inside their own stillness, and some in the lobby, and some in their trucks with the heaters running, and all of them present in the specific way of people who have decided something and are waiting for the decision to require them. At 6:58 a.m., Jax's lawyer arrived. Her name was Connie Marsh, 51 years old, a former public defender who had spent 20 years learning the architecture of systems designed to look like help and had developed a particular expertise in the gap between what those systems claimed to do and what they actually did. She was small and precise and had the manner of someone who had long since stopped being surprised by anything and had redirected the energy that surprise would have used into something more functional. She wore a coat that had seen many winters and carried a bag that contained, among other things, a tablet, a portable printer, and 11 years' worth of contacts in Wyoming's legal and administrative infrastructure. She shook Jax's hand once. She looked at the card. She looked at the name. "Garfield," she said. "You know him?" "Know of him." She set her bag down on the waiting room table. "He's been moved 3 times in 12 years. Different county divisions each time. Never fired, never formally reprimanded, just rotated." She opened her tablet. "Which is what happens to people who are useful to the structure rather than to the stated function. Can you get the placement records for the 2 children before Tommy?" "I can try. It'll take a court order or someone willing to pull them without one." She looked at him. "You have 41 hours left on the provisional." "I know." "Then stop explaining things to me and let me work." She worked. The morning moved with the quality of time passing under pressure, not slowly, but with a density to each minute that made it feel counted. Tommy was assessed by Dr. Reyes at 8 a.m., and the foot was, in her word, progressing, which was doctor language for the tissue was responding, and the outcome was still good if the next 72 hours were managed correctly. She wrote specific instructions for follow-up care, specific enough that she looked directly at Jax when she handed them over and said, "This requires someone who will actually do these things." "I understand," Jax said. "Every 12 hours. Not when it's convenient." "Every 12 hours," he said. Marcus was awake by 9. Jax went to his room alone and sat beside the bed, and the 2 men looked at each other in the particular way of men who are brothers in the way that counts. Not blood, not paperwork, but years of showing up. And Marcus said before anything else, "The boys." "Home with Dana. Both fine." "Who?" "There was a kid," Jax said. "On the mountain." He paused. "He carried them up." Marcus looked at the ceiling. His arm was in a proper cast now, his face cleaned of the dried blood, an IV in his left arm, and the particular gray of someone who had survived something significant and was still processing the accounting. "How old?" 15. Marcus was quiet. "His name's Tommy Voss," Jax said. Marcus turned his head. The movement was small, just a few degrees on the pillow, but the way it happened, the specific quality of it, the aliveness that came into his face, told Jax that the name had landed somewhere that mattered. "Say that again," Marcus said. "Tommy Voss." Marcus closed his eyes, opened them. "Sandra's boy." "Sandra. My cousin. She died 6, 7 years ago. Overdose." He said it the way you say things that have been grieved for long enough that the word has become a fact rather than a wound. "She had a son. I tried to find him after. The state had him already. It was—" He stopped. "I sent a card. To the last address the system would give me." He looked at Jax. "They told me there was no direct relative petition available given my secondary relationship. They told me to consult an attorney. I was 26 and working 2 jobs and I—" He stopped again. "I should have pushed harder." "You couldn't have known," Jax said, which was true, and also not the point. Not now. "Where is he?" "Down the hall." Jax looked at his brother-in-law's face. "And we've got 40 hours to make sure he stays somewhere safe after they come to collect him." Marcus tried to sit up. "Stay in the bed," Jax said. "Jax, I have Connie on it. I need you in that bed functional, not aggravating your arm." He held Marcus's eyes. "He's here. He's not going anywhere tonight. Let me work." Marcus lay back. His jaw worked once. "He carried my nephews up a mountain." "Yes." "Sandra's boy." "Yes." The silence between them had the quality of something being put in place, not resolved, not healed, but acknowledged, located, given coordinates that could be returned to. At 10:15 a.m., the county issue sedan came back. It didn't pull into the parking lot this time. It stopped on the street across from the hospital entrance. Just stopped, engine running, the kind of presence that was designed to be noticed without being technically actionable. Boone was the one who saw it first, and he came to Jack's without theater. "He's watching the entrance," Boone said. "Just watching?" "Has been for 20 minutes. Made one call. Still on the same spot." Jax went to the window. The car was there, some dark blue, county plates, positioned with a clear sight line to the emergency entrance and the main lot where the bikes were. The driver was not visible clearly from this distance, but the positioning was not coincidence. "They're waiting for something," Rook said from behind him. "What kind of something?" Jack said. "Something that gives them a reason to come in." Rook's voice was careful and specific. "Right now they've got a provisional arrangement signed by a county caseworker and a lawyer on site. They need something that breaks the arrangement, something they can characterize as an unsafe environment or a violation of the provisional terms." Jax looked at the 17 motorcycles in the lot. He understood. The presence of the Iron Shepherds at this hospital, the cuts, the patches, the sheer number of large men with records who had, in the eyes of anyone looking for a reason, turned a county medical facility into what could be characterized as a gathering of an outlaw motorcycle organization, was the thing they were waiting to weaponize. Not for what it was, for what it could be made to look like in a report filed by the right person in the right office. He went back to the waiting room. "Listen up," he said. The room came to attention without sound, the way these men came to attention, not through posture, not through any theater of focus, but through a stilling that was total and immediate. "They're going to use us," Jack said. "The bikes, the cuts, the number of us here. They need an incident or a document that describes one. That document, filed under the right code, voids the provisional and gives them custody before Connie can respond." Nobody spoke. "I need everyone without a direct role in the next 12 hours to not be here," Jack said. "Not permanently. Not retreating, just absent from this specific location in a way that removes the ammunition." He looked around the room. "I know what I'm asking." Diesel, from the corner, said, "You're asking us to leave the kid." "I'm asking you to leave the parking lot," Jack said. "There's a difference." A silence. Then Rook said, "There are other positions." And Jax nodded once, because there were. Within 20 minutes, the lot had thinned. The bikes went in 2s and 3s, not hurried, not conspicuous, just dispersing with the natural rhythm of men who had places to be. What they left was 4 motorcycles and 2 trucks, the minimum that communicated presence without providing the visual of an occupation. What they did with the rest was position, because men who had spent years in complicated situations understood that the geometry of where you were not standing was sometimes as important as where you were. The county sedan sat across the street. At 11:40 a.m., a second car arrived. Not county fleet. A private vehicle, dark gray, which parked in the structure and from which emerged 2 men in civilian clothes who walked to the hospital entrance with the specific body language of people who were not here in any official capacity and who understood exactly what that meant for what they could and couldn't do. Rook made one call. Connie looked up from her tablet. "Describe them." Rook described them. "The shorter one," Connie said. "Check his right wrist. Should be a tattoo." "Eagle." Rook looked. "Yes," he said. Connie was quiet for 3 seconds. Then, "That's Webb, not Marcus. Frank Webb. He works contractor side for the same network that manages the residential facilities." She paused. "He is not here to help." "What is he here to do?" Jack said. "The same thing the sedan is doing," Connie said. "Looking for a breach, looking for something to file." She looked at Jax directly. "They want the boy badly enough to send 2 separate approaches. That tells me the records Sella found are just the surface." "What's underneath?" Connie set her tablet face down on the table. It was the first time she had done that since she arrived, and the gesture had a weight to it. "I pulled a favor this morning," she said, "from the clerk at family court in Cheyenne. It took her 4 hours to find because the files had been restructured under a different case code. She stopped. The two children before Tommy, the ones removed after medical presentations and redirected to network facilities. She looked at Jax. They weren't just placed there. They were placed under a specific provision that transferred their state guardianship to the facility director upon placement. The room had gone completely still. Which means, Connie continued, the state's legal responsibility for those children ended at the moment of transfer. No mandated review, no annual check-in, no foster licensing requirements. She paused. They essentially ceased to exist in the system. Boone's voice from the door. Where are they now? That, Connie said, is what I cannot find. Tommy had been listening through the open door of the waiting room, his foot in the thermal wrap, the modified boot on his right foot, his back against the door frame, and his face showing the specific expression of someone who has understood something faster than the room has finished explaining it. They're going to do the same thing to me, he said. Everyone looked at him. Transfer the guardianship, Tommy said. As soon as Helms's 48 hours is up, they'll have the provision ready to file. He looked at Connie. How fast can they move something through family court? With the right judge, same day, Connie said. Who's the right judge? Jack said. Connie's expression answered that before her voice did. The same one, she said. Who signed the provision for the two children before Tommy? The two men from the gray car were visible in the lobby now. They hadn't approached the desk. They were standing at the window of the coffee station with cups they weren't drinking, positioned with a direct sightline to the hallway that led to the ER wing, to Tommy's room. Jax looked at them. He felt the controlled rage, not hot, not the kind that moved fast and broke things, but the cold kind, the kind that moved with precision, that identified targets and options, and applied force where force would do what needed doing. He had lived inside this feeling for significant portions of his adult life. He knew its weight. He knew what to do with it and what not to do with it. Connie, he said, can you get a formal relative petition filed before midnight tomorrow? Marcus isn't... He's a blood relative of the child. Secondary but documented. Jax held her eyes. And he's 40 feet down the hall. Connie looked at him. If Marcus files a formal relative petition, she said slowly, it creates a legal conflict of interest with any simultaneous guardianship transfer. The court can't process both on the same timeline without a hearing. She paused. That buys a hearing date. How long? Minimum 10 days, possibly 30. File it, Jack said. I need Marcus's consent and signature, so get your printer. She was already moving. At 12:20 p.m., Frank Webb and the man with him separated. The second man moved toward the nurse's station at the end of the ER wing. He was heading toward Tommy's room. Diesel saw it first. He was on his feet before Jax could turn, not running, not aggressive, just moving with the particular mass and purpose of a large man who has decided to occupy a specific piece of space that someone else was also heading for. And he arrived at the mouth of the hallway 3 steps ahead of the man and stopped there the way large men who know how to stop, which is to say completely weight down, not going anywhere. The man pulled up short. Wrong wing, Diesel said. His voice was the voice of a diesel engine at low idle, unhurried, continuous, not raising itself for anything. I'm looking for... Wrong wing, Diesel said again. The man looked at him, looked at the hallway behind him. Made a calculation. He turned back to the lobby. Jax crossed to Diesel's position and looked at the man's back as he retreated, and then he looked at the lobby where Frank Webb was standing, and Webb was looking back at him, and the two men held each other's eyes across the distance with the particular recognition of people who understand exactly what is happening and exactly what the parameters of it are. And the parameters right now were these. Webb had no legal authority, no filed document, and no action he could take that wouldn't itself become a record. And Jax had a lawyer, a provisional arrangement, and 17 men in positions within a 4-block radius who had been notified 10 minutes ago that the geometry of the situation had changed. Webb took his coffee cup to a table and sat down. Waiting. Connie came to the doorway of the waiting room at 12:50 p.m. She was holding a single sheet of paper that had come off her portable printer, and her expression had the quality of someone who has finished a thing they weren't certain was possible. "Marcus, sign," she said. Jax took the paper. Read it. The formal relative petition for emergency kinship placement of Thomas Allen Voss, minor, filed under the name Marcus James Webb, secondary blood relative, dated this day, notarized with the emergency notary stamp that Connie carried for exactly these moments. "When does it file?" Jack said. "It's already transmitted," Connie said. "Cheyenne Family Court received it at 12:47 p.m. She paused. "We now have a conflict on record." The silence that followed was not relief. It was something adjacent to it. The silence of a round won in a fight that still had rounds left. Jax looked down the hallway toward Tommy's room. Then he went there. Tommy was sitting on the edge of the bed when Jax came in, his foot on the floor with the thermal wrap, his hands in his lap, and his face carrying the expression of someone who has been alone with themselves for an hour and has not liked all of what they found there. Jax handed him the petition paper without saying anything. Tommy read it again. His hands were very still. "Marcus filed this," he said. "Yes. He hasn't seen me in 6 years." "He knows who you are," Jack said. Tommy looked at the paper. Something in his face was doing the thing it had done the night before in the waiting room when Seth took his hand. The cracking. The thing beneath the surface finding an opening and not knowing how to behave in the open air. "This doesn't fix it," Tommy said. His voice was careful, like he was afraid if he wasn't careful something was going to break that couldn't be unbroken. "No," Jax said. "It buys time." "And after the time?" Jax looked at him. "After the time was," he said, "we fight it in court, with everything we have, the records, the connection between Henderson and Garfield, the 2 children before you, the judge, the provision, all of it." He paused. "It's not going to be clean or fast or easy." "Nothing is," Tommy said. "No." Jax held his eyes. "But I've been in ugly fights before. The difference is whether you're in them alone." Tommy looked at the paper in his hands. At the name Marcus James Webb printed beside his own, the documentary evidence of a connection that had existed all along and had been buried under 6 years of systems that found it inconvenient. "There are 2 kids somewhere," Tommy said. "The ones before me. In those facilities." "I know. We can't—" He stopped. "Someone has to look for them." "Connie's on it," Jack said. "That's not enough," Tommy said. "Not accusatory, just specific. They've been in there for years. They're past what Connie can find in a court record." He looked up. "You have people who know how to find things that aren't in court records." Jax was quiet. "You're asking me to expand this," he said. "I'm asking you to look," Tommy said. "That's different." A silence. Then Jax said, "Get some rest," which was not no. Tommy lay back on the bed and stared at the ceiling and listened to the sound of Jax's boots leaving the room, and then the silence of the hallway, and then, from somewhere outside the building, distant but present, the sound of a Harley engine starting up. One of his men repositioning, or checking in, or simply marking presence the way engines marked presence. And the sound came through the wall and the window and settled into the room like something that had decided to stay. He closed his eyes. In the lobby, Frank Webb was still at his table. He had been on his phone for the last 10 minutes, and the person he was talking to, the person whose name appeared nowhere in the records Sella had found, the person who sat at the center of the network, not as its director or its manager, but as its architect, the person who had understood 15 years ago that the most durable form of institutional corruption was the kind that looked exactly like institutional function. That person was now aware that the 48-hour window had a complication, a relative petition, a lawyer, a motorcycle club president who had connections, and the specific stubborn loyalty of a man who did not let go of things he had decided mattered. The person on the other end of Webb's call was quiet for a long moment. Then they said 4 words. Webb listened to them. His face, which had maintained its civilian blankness for 3 hours, did something that a nurse passing the table registered as unusual and filed away without understanding. Not anger, not fear, but the specific expression of a man who has received a directive that he knows is going to change the nature of what this day is. He ended the call, he stood up, he walked to the exit, and he pushed through the door, and the cold air of the Wyoming morning hit him, and he walked to the gray car in the structure, and he made 2 more calls, and the calls were short, and when he finished them, he sat in the car with the engine running and looked at the hospital entrance, and at the 4 motorcycles in the lot, and at the 2 trucks with men in them, and he calculated. And in a building 12 blocks north of the hospital, in an office that had no visible signage on its door and no listing in the county directory, a phone rang for the second time that morning, and the person who answered it picked up on the first ring and listened, and when the listening was done, began to move. The move they were making was not the county sedan. It was not Frank Webb. It was not Garfield or Patricia Helms or any of the paper mechanisms that had been deployed in the last 12 hours. What was now in motion was the thing they kept for situations where the paper mechanisms had been insufficient, and it was heading for the hospital, and it was going to arrive before dark. They came at 4:17 p.m. Not Webb, not Garfield, not anyone with a clipboard or a county jacket or the paper infrastructure of a system moving through its official channels. What came was a man named Cutter, no first name anyone had ever used, no title that appeared on any document, who worked for the network's architect the way certain tools work, without asking why, without needing to understand the larger project, useful precisely because of his willingness to function in the space between what was legal and what was recorded. He came with 2 others. They entered through the parking structure, not the main entrance, which told Rook, who had been watching the structure since noon, everything about what kind of arrival this was. Rook made the call before they cleared the stairwell door. What followed was not a fight in the way that fights are dramatized. It was not loud, not long, not the kind of thing that produced injuries requiring explanation. It was 3 men who entered a hospital expecting a boy and a lawyer and perhaps a few large men in leather, and it was 17 men who had been in position for 6 hours, who had eaten nothing and slept nothing, and whose patience had the specific quality of a compressed spring that had been told to wait and had waited and was now done waiting. Cutter got as far as the hallway outside Tommy's room. Diesel was already in the hallway. What Diesel said was 4 words. What Cutter saw when he looked past Diesel was not just Diesel. It was Rook and Boone, and 4 others distributed through the corridor with the unhurried posture of men who had been in corridors like this before and knew exactly what they were doing in them. Cutter made his own calculation. He left. His 2 men left with him. And the moment they cleared the parking structure and the gray car pulled onto the street, Connie was already on the phone to the Wyoming State Attorney General's office with the name of the network's architect, the name of the judge, the names of the 2 children, the case codes that had been restructured to hide them, and the documentation that Sela had assembled across 14 hours of middle-of-the-night work, everything, all of it, delivered to a deputy attorney general who had been looking for a thread on this particular operation for 2 years and had never had one long enough to pull. She had one now. The architect was taken into custody 11 days later. Garfield resigned the day the investigation became public record. The judge recused himself from family court pending review and was suspended within the month. Dale Henderson was arrested on charges that had nothing to do with Tommy and everything to do with the 2 children before him, both of whom were found alive, unhurt in the narrow physical sense, carrying the specific damage of children who have spent years in places that process them rather than loved them, in a network facility outside Sheridan. Both were placed with families within 60 days. Connie handled the paperwork. The relative petition for Tommy moved through family court in 22 days. Marcus signed everything from his hospital bed, and then from his kitchen table, and then from the courthouse in Cheyenne on a Tuesday morning when the sky was the specific pale blue of a Wyoming winter that had decided to be beautiful for one day. And Tommy stood beside him in a button-down shirt that Jax had bought him and boots that were new and fit correctly without tape. And the judge who heard the case was not the suspended judge but a woman named Okafor, who read the file in its entirety before the hearing and spent 3 minutes looking at Tommy before she said anything. What she said was, "This should have happened 6 years ago." Then she signed. Marcus drove them back to Rollins in his truck, his arm out of the cast now but still careful, and nobody talked for the first 40 miles, which was the right amount of not talking. And then Seth called from the back seat where he had been installed next to Tommy for the entire drive and said vroom without preamble. And Tommy said vroom back, and that was the whole conversation, and it was enough. The Iron Shepherds held what they called a gathering 2 weeks after the hearing at the Forge, on a Saturday night when the temperature had climbed back above freezing for the first time in 6 weeks, and the parking lot could hold the number of bikes that showed up without anyone having to park on the street. It was not a ceremony. It was not formal in any way that required a name. It was men and their families eating and drinking and existing in the same space with the specific texture of people who have been through something and have come out the other side and are taking a moment to acknowledge that before moving forward. Tommy sat at the long table nearest the wood stove. His foot was still in a support boot, the recovery ongoing, the follow-up appointments marked in a phone that was new and had Jax's number as the first contact. He ate. He didn't say much. He watched the room with the attention of someone who is still learning whether a place is safe, still running the background check that becomes automatic in children who have needed it to survive, and what he found in the running of it was not the all-clear of perfect safety. He was 15, not naive, but something he didn't have a word for yet and was slowly building one. Boone sat across from him at some point in the evening and put a cup of coffee in front of him without asking and said nothing. And Tommy wrapped his hands around it, and the warmth moved through his palms and into his wrists, and Boone smoked and looked at the room and was company in the specific way that Boone was company. Without demand, without theater, just present. "You doing okay?" Boone said eventually. Tommy thought about it honestly. "Getting there," he said. Boone nodded. That was the conversation. Later, when the room had thinned and the wood stove was doing most of the work of keeping the space livable, Jax came and sat beside him, and the two of them looked at the fire for a while. "You know what I thought," Tommy said, "when I heard them. In the car." Jax waited. "I thought—" He stopped, started again. "I thought about walking past. I ran the numbers. I knew what it would cost." He looked at his hands around the coffee cup. "I almost kept walking." "But you didn't," Jax said. "No." "Why?" Tommy was quiet for a long moment. "Because they needed someone," he said finally. "And I was there." Jax looked at him, at the boy who had walked out of a house where no one protected him, and into a blizzard, and had found, in the worst conditions of his life, the first people he had ever been able to protect. The mathematics of it, the specific, painful, human mathematics of a child who had never been chosen learning to choose, sat in the air between them without needing to be stated. "You're not alone anymore," Jack said. He said it the way he said things he meant, without inflection, without decoration, just the plain fact of it laid down. Tommy didn't say anything, but his hand stopped moving against the coffee cup, and his shoulders, those shoulders that had not fully dropped since Jax had first seen him in the shed, that had carried 6 years of monitoring and readiness and the muscular memory of a boy who had learned that ease was a trap, came down just slightly, just enough, in the warmth of the fire and the smell of coffee and the low sound of engines outside as the last few bikes moved in the parking lot, their headlights sweeping briefly through the window and then going quiet. He had been walking toward something without knowing what it was. He had walked through the worst night of his life to find it. And sitting in a roadhouse in Wyoming with a cup of coffee and a man who had decided he mattered and a room full of people who had shown up when showing up was the only answer. Tommy Voss, 15 years old, finally stopped running, not because someone saved him, because he had already proven, in the snow and the dark and the impossible cold, that he was worth saving, and this time there were people around who knew how to make that mean something. Outside, the last engine went quiet. The cold stayed where cold belonged, and inside the fire kept going.